Finally, let me just say a word on human security. Many developing countries today are spending 2, 4, 6 and sometimes more % of their national income on armies and military budgets, ostensibly for the protection of a country's national borders against threats from abroad. In fact, if you look at the nature of conflict in the last 30, 40 years, most of the conflicts observed are linked to civil wars within countries, not the attacks from abroad. So we need, as the Human Development Report and as the UN has increasingly emphasized, including the present Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, to move to a concept of human security, the protection of people by means of all sorts of supports against risks, including risks to violence, but often risks of disease or otherwise. And what is needed is a whole new mindset of what is meant by human security if there's protection of people against the diversity of threats. This will also help reduce inequalities and thus the causes of many internal conflicts, as Francis Stewart in Oxford has said. Right, I come to the end, so let me remind you with some conclusions for strategy and for what the UN and the UK can do. In the last 2 or 3 decades, inequalities have soared nationally and internationally. In many countries, rising inequality has been a major cause of rising poverty, or the failure of economic growth to reduce poverty and achieve the MDGs. Growth is important for the achievement of the MDGs, but the pattern and structure of this growth needs to be made central if poverty is to be reduced. Policies for the reduction of inequalities, combined with redistributive growth, need to be made part of the MDG strategy. It would be wonderful if the new Minister of Development in the UK was to make this point at the meetings in New York in the UN in September. Such a strategy would embody 4 priorities: redistributive growth, increasing public expenditure for MDG achievement in using taxation in progressive ways, focusing MDG achievement on those missed out, the poorest and marginal groups, and increased attention to human security with reductions in military expenditure. Each of these 4 priorities would help accelerate the effort towards the MDGs. And donor support and aid are needed for all this, as well as being a step towards humanitarian action to ease internal conflicts. And these elements, redistributive growth, need to be a focus for monitoring on these outcomes and making them public in order to help build up global interest and support. Friends, Erskine Childers, in one of his final activities, teamed up with another distinguished UN official, in this case a Brit, Brian Urquhart, and produced a series of highly influential publications, renewing the United Nations towards a more effective UN, and the final one, A World in Need of Leadership, Tomorrow's United Nations. The MDGs are the greatest commitment ever made by governments and the UN towards the reduction of global poverty. Delivering on the promise is at the top of today's UN agenda and will be a major topic at the General Assembly in September. The UN deserves full and wholehearted support in its leadership towards the MDGs from the UK, from all other governments, and from NGOs like Action for UN Renewal and the World Disarmament Campaign. Thank you.
very much, Sir Richard, for your extremely thought-provoking lecture and for explaining so graphically and clearly the links between inequality and the Millennium Development Goals. Well, now I'd like to welcome Lord Judd, who will give a response. And before I hand over to him, just a little bit of background. Lord, he's a British Labour politician. He was Minister for Overseas Development from 1976 to 1977, and Minister of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 1977 to 79. He went on to become Director of Oxfam. He was made a life peer in 1991. So, Lord Judd, welcome.
Thank you very much. Just before I turn to Richard and what he's been saying, I just feel compelled to say one thing. Underlying our concerns, and indeed underlying what Richard is talking about, I'm sure, amongst most of us here this evening, if not absolutely everybody, is a concern for justice. And justice not simply because qualitatively we shall have a better society if justice in the operation of society is self-evident, but also probably, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment or two, the prospects for enduring peace and stability, in my view, will always be jeopardized by an absence of justice. And I want to say in that context, and believe you me, I have no right, extremely good, and I'm very glad to see the government represented at this meeting this evening, but I have absolutely no grief for the government. But I must say that although it's taken 30 years, there was a momentous step towards justice today when the Saville report was published, and was published with absolutely unequivocal condemnation of what happened on Bloody Sunday and for those who perpetrated it. But what I think was very impressive, and I say that as somebody who is very much a member of the opposition, what was very important today was the powerful and unqualified language with which the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, endorsed what Saville had said, and said that it was impossible to condone or support the unjustified actions of that day, and that they were unjustifiable. And I must say that I was glad to hear that, and it gave me a great deal of hope about how, in the end, truth and justice can prevail. Because, of course, one of the things that Saville said in his report was that Bloody Sunday actually accentuated the conflict in Northern Ireland and made it more prolonged than it would otherwise have been. So I want to pay that tribute to the government, because I think on this they have clearly staked out that they are backing Saville in his stand for justice. And I think that's an important thing to say today, because this is an Erskine Childers Day. And I think Erskine Childers would have taken heart from this in the context of Ireland. But now, more specifically, to Richard. First of all, I always feel very emotional when I find myself with Richard, because I can remember as a young member of Parliament, way back in the 60s, when we were starting, when we were initiating the concept of select committees. I had served on the Public Accounts Committee, but I made a deliberate bid to go on to the select committee that was established on overseas aid and development. And who should be our advisor but one very radical, dynamic, imaginative and visionary academic from Sussex, one Richard Jolly. And I always admire people who stayed with it throughout their lives. And listening to Richard today, he's the man of the same convictions and the same principles that so impressed us all then.